It was the summer of 1884, deep in the Colorado Territory, where the land was stubborn men even more sown power was measured by the cattle on your range, and the silence in your Namath Callaway ranch stretched wide across that dust-blown land 15,000. Head of cattle 60 ranch hands and one man at the top. Woe didn't take kindly to question Silas Callaway. But this story ain't about him, it's about his son Garrett Callaway, a man raised in the shadow of a legacy so large it left no room for doubts or dreams or love. Garrett walked into the study with the same expression he wore during a cattle auction. Calm, firm, unreadably. The room smelled like cigar smoke, and old power Silas didn't look up when he spoke. It's time. Garrett didn't flinch, just stood tall. Time for what? Silas slid a folded envelope across the desk. His voice was flat as an anvil. You're marrying Evelyn McCrae this Saturday. Garrett blinked once, not from surprise but disbelief. Evelyn McCrae, the girl from the ridge, thought that family was all but dust and pride. Silas leaned back in his chair. She's still got her father's land barely, and she's the last of her. Nama joining with us makes sense. Garrett crossed his arms. So now I'm breeding stock. You are a Callaway, Silas said, voice hardening. You don't marry for flutters and fireworks, you marry for land, for legacy, just like I did. Garrett stared at his father, the man who built an empire without ever once saying the word love. Wanted to argue, to law, to walk out, but something in him saw a thing. Old and tired stayed still. You even know what she looks like? Garrett asked. Pretty enough, sharp enough, that's all that matters. You'll say the vows there outside was thick with dust and judgment. Garrett walked past the stables, past the bunkhouse, past the fence line where sky and land touched, and nothing felt certain. Evelyn McCrae, he remembered her vague lithe way you remember a storm from a decade ago. Quiet girl, smart. Ice kept to herself it. If the stories were true, time hadn't been kind, and neither was this bargain. Muttered to no one, this is madness, but deep down, buried under duty and drought-hardened skin, a single question echoed louder than the rest. What if she isn't what they say? Today's ladder at Callaway Chapel stood dressed in sun-dried cedar. In silence there were no rose snow ribbons, just wind dust, and the sound of whispers scurried through old wood and narrow pews. Garrett Callaway stood at the front of the chaplain, a black coat and boots splished enough to reflect regret. His hat rested on the bench beside him. One of the few signs he was taking this serious, even if his jaw was clenched like a locked teeth. Crowd was small, a few ranch hands. A preacher who owed Silas a favor and a handful of town folks came to witness his story. Scandal. Evelyn McCrae hadn't been seen in public in years. Net since her father died, her family name fell out of favor like a horse that couldn't run. Then came the creak of the door. She didn't ride and she didn't Gladesh, walked measured, straight. Violet, her dress was simple dove gray buttoned high, no frills. Veil shimmered like mist over morning grass. Garrett didn't move. He expected nervous, expected awkwardness. Instead she moved like someone who'd practiced being underestimated. Preacher began the old voused familiar words. Do you, Garrett Callaway, do? And do you? Evelyn McCrae, her voice was soft, clear. I doth, and you may lift the veil. Garrett hesitated just a beat, and reached forward, fingertips grazing the lace, and slowly drew the veil back. And there she was, not plain, not forgettable, not meek. Evelyn McCrae had the kind of beauty that didn't beget waited. Her eyes met his, steady, unwavering, and for the first time in years Garrett Callaway felt uncertain, not because she was stunning, but because she knew he hadn't expected her to. Bash stood there, calm, composed, untouchable, and he suddenly didn't know whether it just made the worst mistake of his life or the best one. The Callaway ranch house was big, not just in square footage but in weight. Every plank carried history, every nail a name, and now it had 2 more names inside, adjoined by law, not love. Garrett opened the front door and stepped east like a gentleman, or maybe just a host. Evelyn entered, eyes steady, boots echoing lightly on the polished floorboard. She took in the place with a single sweeping glance, not admiring, assessing. This where I'm expected to stay? She asked, voice calm. Garrett nodded. Ansroom down the halls, yersmans across, no warmth, no welcome, just architecture and obligation. Evelyn unpacked in silence, books, a worn journal, a leather pouch of dried herbs, a small framed photograph of her father. The kind of items that carry memory like scent. An old cloth ease in the room across the hall. Garrett sat at the edge of his bedshirt, unbuttoned, rubbing the bridge of his nose like it might explain anything. No words had passed between them since the veil came down. No awkward laterno gestures of affection, just the sound of 2 doors clicking, shoot in perfect unison. Evelyn was up before dawn. She didn't tiptoe, she moved within tempi. The time Garrett stumbled in hair-damp boots. Lush was already seated at the kitchen table. A cup of black coffee in front of her and the ranch's financial ledger open beside Ith Blinkadure. Reading the books. You left them out, she said, flipping a page. Figured I'd learn how this place breathes before trying to change its lungs. Garrett frowned, pulling out a chair across from Harry. You always talk like that, only when people assume I'm not. Thinking something passed between them, then it heat. Not yet, just a pause, the kind that Sadie see you. I'm not what you expected, and neither are you. Garrett cleared his throat, reached for his coffee, and took a long, slow sip, not to drink but to buy time. Flynn returned to the numbers without another word, and for the first time since she'd arrived wondered what else does she know. Out hurry, a dry wind and a careless spark can ruin a legacy faster than a six-shooter. Fire ain't just danger, it's wreckin'. Garrett was out at the south fence line inspecting a busted post when the smell hit him. Not wood smoke from a campfire. This was different, wild, sharp, fast. He didn't hesitate. Fire yelled, boot heels digging hard into dirt as he mounted his horse and galloped toward the barn. Wrench hands scrambled buckets, flumen cursed the wind, and in the middle of the cow sleeves rolled skirts hitched stood Evelyn, hauling to pails of water like she'd been born doing it. Garrett pulled hard on the reins, dismounted in a rush. What the hell are you doing? She didn't stop moving. Helping you'll get yourself killed, so will your fence line, she snapped back, eyes flashing their gaze is locked smoke in the air, heat on their skin. Then without another word, Garrett grabbed a bucket and followed. The blaze didn't take the fence, but it left its mark. Smoke hung low like an uneasy truce. Garrett and Evelyn stood shoulder to shoulder, clothes soaked, faces streaked with ash. You ever fight fire before? He asked, breathing hard. No, she said, but I've had to hold back worse. Glanced at her, really looked this time not just at the dirt on her face or the wet strands of hair clinging to her cheek, but at the way she stood, unshaken, unbent. Didn't have to do all. Faith said, neither did you, she replied, but we did it anyway. She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him there stunned, silent, and suddenly unsure if he'd been the strong Onel along a fire leaves behind ash and silence. But sometimes when the wind settles and the sky clears, you realize something else is rising, something you didn't know had been smoldering. Days passed. The ranch went back to rhythm. Fences mended, livestock grazed, but the air between Garrett and Evelyn, that was different now. It wasn't cold anymore, just quiet, like a question waiting for an answer. Garrett stepped into the room, boots, dusty shirt half unbuttoned. Evelyn sat by the window, sunlight caught in the pages of a book, spine cracked, corners worn. What are you reading? He Esquita training manual, she said. Mustangs, wild ones, says they run until they don't. Garrett chuckled under his breath. Sounds like me. Evelyn smiled barely, but it was the first real one he'd seen. Sat across from her, elbows on the table. Do you agree to the marriage? He a sketch looked at him, not startled, not defensive. Because I was tired of surviving Alanish, said Garrett. Leaned in slight. Linnet, tired of being alone? No, just tired of pretending it didn't matter. Later they sat side by side, separate cups of coffee going cold on the railing. Sky stretched wide and clear, full of stars and things unspoken. Garrett broke the silence. A misjudged you weren't the only one, she said. No, what did you expect me to be? Evelyn turned toward him, gaze steady, louder, dumber, meaner. Garrett burst out laughing, real and warm, and Evelyn joined him. Just a little. It wasn't a romantic moment, not yet, but it was something rarer. Ease out in Hollow Creek. Summer fair wasn't just about pies and horseshoes, it was about faces, appearances, stories told without words. And this year the biggest story walked in wearing a plain blue dress and a name nobody expected to matter again. Evelyn McCrae Calloway. Garrett rode beside her, straight-backed and stone-faced, but he wasn't the one folks were whispering about. No one had seen her in years, and those who remembered her didn't expect this. Evelyn didn't shrink, she didn't flash smiles or flutter lashes, walked steady, eyes scanning myth, soft but sure. Children waved, some adults nodded stiffly, others just stared. Garrett watched her, curious, protective, but mostly impressed. She didn't just carry herself well, she carried history and turned it into grace. Evelyn stood alone by the baked goods, shredding tiny handwriting on a cherry pie label. When to local wives sidled near, Thather McCrae girl, sure as spit hot she'd be. Plainer, doesn't say much. The Evelyn didn't flinch, she turned and looked at them, calm as still water. My father used to say, talk less and let your work answer louder. They blinked, one of them cleared her throat. Would you like a slice? Only if you're sharing it, honest. Liveland said. They laughed awkward, but real a thaw begangret saw the exchange. Watched how she handled judgment like reins in a strong hand, never yanking, never letting gowan. He stepped beside her again, he said they expected someone smaller, they weren't the only ones. She replied without looking at him, smiled just barely, you carry yourself like you own the place, don't she said bet. I know how to live in it. They walked back to the horses in quiet rhythm, dust curling around there. Bootsguard glanced at her, you care what they think. No, she said, but I care what you think. Stopped walking, hand brushing Hurston. Maybe I ought to start thinking clear. Night came slow that day, like it knew something sacred was about to be spoken, and wanted to give it space. There was still kind of still that made a man linger it. Sat on the porch steps, boots off, glass in hand, staring at stars like they might answer things. He hadn't yet dared to ask. Evelyn stepped out, barefoot, cardigan around her shoulders. Didn't say a word, just sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth. They sat there for a while, saying nothing until the silence began to speak for them. You ever wonder, Garrett said, if life would have been simpler if we hadn't said yes? Evelyn didn't look at him, just sipped her tea. I don't think I ever knew, Simplesh said, even before Garrett exhaled hard like he'd been holding something inside too long. I didn't want this marriage, didn't want you, not because of who you are, just because I didn't know how to be anything else but what my father told me. And now, he turned toward her, searching. No, I sit beside you, and I wish I'd met you before all the noise, before the land and the names and the deal. Evelyn's eyes didn't shin. Thee held, you're meeting me now, she said. Is that enough? He skedenly, if you mean it, she repleaded. If you're brave enough to keep doing it. Garrett reached over, not to grab, not to claim, just to rest his hand on hers. Didn't move away, no kiss, no grand vow, just skin and truth, and the kind of shared quiet that heals more than it hurts. He never imagined. You, he whispered, that's the thing about real things. She said they don't need imagining, just seeing, and above them the stars blink, it like wishes, but like promise. Every man comes to a line in the dirt, a line drawn by someone else, be blood or fear or legacy, and every man's got to decide whether to cross it or erase it. Garrett Calloway stood in his father's study next morning, coat unbuttoned, jaw tight, hands clenched, just enough to tremble. Silas looked up from his papers like nothing had changed. But everything had. You've been distracted, Silas said casually, sipping coffee. That woman has you second-guessing things. She's not that woman, Garrett said. Silas didn't blink. She's your wife. That was the deal. She gets security, get land, and you keep the name intact. No, Garrett Sage gets more than that. Silas narrowed his eyes. You are getting sentimental. I'm getting free, Garrett answered. From what? Silas snapped. Everything I built for you. Garrett took a slow breath from the idea that power is better than peace. You marry who you're told, Silas growled. You hold the land, you hold the name. That's how this stays ours. Garrett stepped forward, voice low and steady. It's not staying mine. If I lose myself to keep it. Silas stared at him for a long moment, the look of a man will realize the reins were no longer in his hand. You disappoint me. Good, Garrett said. Means I'm not you. Garrett found Evelyn by the horsehair braided sleeves, rolled, checking the feed bins like she owned the world or didn't need. Tosh turned when she heard his footsteps. Well, I told him, Garrett said, stopping just shy of her space, that I choose you not because it makes sense and not because it's expected. Beckhouse, I want. Tovlin studied him, expression calm, thoughtful, strong. You sure? She asked. I've never been more than. Let's see if you mean it. Tomorrow-sh, said Garrett, tilted his head. What's tomorrow? The Ridge replied. We ride it together if you still feel the same by sundown. I'll believe it. Deal, he said, and for the first time she smiled. First, some folks think love comes like lightning, sudden, loud and forgettable. Out here on the ridge, lines of color, doit comes quieter, like hoof beats and soft dirt, or a hand reaching out when you least expect it. Garrett and Evelyn saddled up at dawn. O ceremony, no audience, say, as two horses, one sky and miles of land that once divided them. No, beneath their shared path. Evelyn rode ahead, at first sure-footed, confident. Garrett stayed close, not to protect but to walk beside. They crossed old markers, rusted fence posts, weathered trees. This used to be your father's, Garrett said, pointing to a gnarled cottonwood. Evelyn nodded. It still is in spirit, but today she looked back at him. It's our sot, the top of the ridge. They stopped at Bellow, lay all of Calloway's imperial cattle grazing, barns, glinting fences stretching like stitched thread. Sacras, a quilt of gold. Garrett pulled off his glove, shelled them tight. Never thought it'd feel like this. Evelyn tilted her head. Like what? He turned to her. Like home. Garrett took her hand, not forceful, not hesitant, just steady. Wanted to build something here, not just fences and barns with you for real. Evelyn met his gaze. Then start, Haresh said, pressing her palm to his chest. Start with Yuvi mounted up again, no longer. Distant, no longer strangers on paper, just to people choosing the same direction. The same dust, the same dawn. Garrett Calloway thought he was marrying for land. Evelyn McRae thought she was marrying for survival, but in the quiet between the stormson, the firelight and starlight and truth spoken softly, found something neither expected. A love that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and stays, and that friends us. How do proud hearts found their way home?